Imagine standing at the edge of a vast ocean at twilight, watching the waves roll in with their ancient rhythm. You could spend your entire life trying to stop those waves, commanding them to cease, willing them to obey your desire for stillness. You could build walls, erect barriers, exhaust yourself in resistance, or you could do something that terrifies most of us to our very core. You could let go. You could surrender. But what does that word even mean, surrender? It lands in our ears like defeat, like weakness, like the final admission that we have failed. We've been taught since childhood that surrender is what happens when you lose, when you give up, when you admit you weren't strong enough. Warriors surrender when they're beaten. Gamblers surrender when they're broke. Dreamers surrender when hope finally dies. Yet there's another kind of surrender that has nothing to do with defeat. A surrender that is not the end of strength but the beginning of it. A surrender that doesn't diminish you, but reveals who you've always been beneath the armour of control, beneath the exhausting performance of having it all together, beneath the relentless striving that has left you hollow and wondering why nothing ever feels like enough.
You don't smile because the world is kind. You smile, and the world often returns the gesture. So too with abundance, with love, with freedom. To wait until you are free, to feel free, is like waiting for silence to begin your song. Acting as if is not an act of ego. It is a surrender to the deeper truth that you are not what happens to you, but what flows through you. The person who waits for proof before believing will always be a step behind, but the one who knows that belief is the proof, that one moves the mountains. That one dances without needing a stage. That one is free.
This is the surrender that the mystic spoke of, that Jung circled around in his work on individuation, that every authentic spiritual tradition recognizes as the threshold between ego and essence, between the small self that grasps and the larger self that simply is. This surrender asks you to stop trying to force life into submission and instead let yourself be shaped by something wiser than your conscious will, something that knows the way even when you cannot see the path. Think about how much energy you spend each day trying to control things that cannot be controlled. The weather, other people's opinions, the past, the future, the fundamental uncertainty of existence itself. You grip these things with white knuckles as if your anxiety could somehow anchor the chaos, as if your worry could prevent disaster, as if your constant vigilance could protect you from the very thing you fear most, which is not pain or loss or failure, but the terrifying recognition that you were never in control to begin with. This illusion of control is so deeply woven into the fabric of modern life that we rarely question it. We are taught to set goals, make plans, manage outcomes, optimize results. We are told that success comes to those who take charge, who refuse to quit, who bend reality to their will through sheer determination and strategic thinking. And there is truth in this, to a point. Action matters, intention matters, effort matters. But somewhere along the way, we confused action with control. We started to believe that if we just tried hard enough, thought it through completely enough, anticipated every possible problem, we could eliminate uncertainty from the equation of our lives. We became like generals preparing for a battle that never quite unfolds according to plan, like architects designing buildings that reality keeps revising, like travelers following maps that bear little resemblance to the actual terrain. And so, we find ourselves exhausted, depleted, running on empty while maintaining the appearance of being full. We smile when we're breaking, perform confidence when we're terrified, pretend we have answers when we're drowning in questions. And underneath it all, there's a whisper, sometimes so quiet you can barely hear it, sometimes so loud it drowns out everything else. The whisper says, let go. The whisper says, you don't have to carry this anymore. The whisper says, surrender. But surrender to what? This is the question that stops most people cold. Because if we're not surrendering to another person, to an enemy, to defeat itself, then what are we surrendering to? The answer is at once simple and profound. You are surrendering to reality, to what is, to the truth of this moment exactly, as it presents itself, stripped of your preferences, your judgments, your desperate attempts to make it into something other than what it is. Carl Jung understood this deeply. He saw how the ego, that small conscious part of ourselves, spends enormous energy trying to maintain its illusion of mastery over the psyche and over life itself. The ego wants to believe it is the author of your story, the director of your internal world, the one in charge. But Jung knew that beneath the ego's narrow beam of consciousness lies the vast unconscious, teeming with forces, drives, archetypes, and wisdom that the conscious mind can barely comprehend, let alone control. Individuation, Jung's term for the process of becoming whole, requires a kind of surrender, not a surrender that obliterates the ego, but one that right-sizes it, that helps the ego recognize its true role. The ego is not meant to be the tyrant of the psyche, but its servant, not the dictator, but the diplomat. Its job is to navigate the external world while remaining in conversation with the deeper currents of the unconscious, allowing those currents to inform, guide, and sometimes completely redirect the course of your life. But the ego fears this surrender more than almost anything. To the ego, surrender feels like death, and in a sense, it is. It is the death of the false self, the constructed identity you've built from 1,000 borrowed ideas about who you should be. It is the death of the persona, that social mask Jung described, which you wear so consistently that you've forgotten it's not your face. It is the death of the illusion that you can think your way out of every problem, control your way to happiness, force life to comply with your vision of how things ought to be. This death terrifies us. So we resist. We tighten our grip. We make more plans, set more goals, try harder, do more, become better. And all the while, life keeps flowing in directions we didn't anticipate, bringing challenges we didn't prepare for, offering gifts we didn't know to ask for, and dismantling our carefully constructed towers of control one brick at a time. You've felt this, haven't you? Those moments when everything you tried to hold together suddenly fell apart. When the relationship you fought so hard to save finally ended. When the career you built crumbled. When the identity you clung to dissolved. When the future you planned evaporated like morning mist. In those moments, you were forced into a kind of surrender whether you wanted it or not. And if you're honest, somewhere in the wreckage, underneath the grief and the fear, there was also a strange lightness, a relief. A sense of finally being able to stop the exhausting performance of holding it all together. This is the paradox at the heart of surrender. What we resist with all our might turns out to be the very thing that sets us free. We think surrender will destroy us, but it actually reveals what cannot be destroyed. We think letting go means losing everything, but we discover that we never really possessed anything to begin with. We think surrendering control will lead to chaos, but we find instead a deeper order, an intelligence far more subtle and sophisticated than our conscious planning could ever achieve. The Taoists understood this. Their concept of Wu Wei, often translated as non-action or effortless action, points to this same truth. It doesn't mean doing nothing. It means aligning yourself with the natural flow of things, acting in harmony with the Tao, the fundamental nature of reality itself, rather than constantly forcing, pushing, resisting, and struggling against what is. It means trusting that there is an intelligence operating in life, in your life, that is far more comprehensive than your individual will. Think of a river finding its way to the ocean. It doesn't make 5-year plans. It doesn't agonize over whether it's taking the most efficient route. It doesn't compare itself to other rivers or worry about whether it's achieving its full potential. It simply flows, responding to the terrain it encounters, taking the path of least resistance, adapting to obstacles not by battling them, but by moving around them or wearing them down over time with patient persistence, and eventually, inevitably, it reaches the ocean. Your life could be like this, Not passive, not weak, not resigned to suffering, but flowing. Responsive rather than reactive. Engaged, but not attached. Working with reality rather than against it. This is what surrender offers. Not defeat, but a different kind of strength. Not giving up, but giving in to a wisdom deeper than your anxious mind can access. But here's what makes this so difficult. Everything in our culture trains us to do the opposite. From the time we're children, we're taught to be in control. Control your emotions. Control your impulses. Control your future through good choices now. We're praised for being in command, criticized for being out of control. The very phrase out of control is an insult, a judgment, a diagnosis of dysfunction. We live in a society that worships control. We control the temperature of our homes, the contents of our refrigerators, the information we consume, the people we interact with. We have medications to control our moods, technologies to control our environments, systems to control uncertainty. The entire apparatus of modern civilization is, in many ways, an elaborate defense against the fundamental uncontrollability of existence. And yet, despite all our advances, all our technologies, all our sophisticated systems of prediction and management, life remains stubbornly, magnificently uncontrollable. Pandemics emerge, economies collapse, relationships end, bodies age, people die. The future refuses to be tamed, and we, exhausted from the effort of trying to tame it, find ourselves anxious, depressed, disconnected, wondering why we feel so alienated in a world we've worked so hard to master. Jung saw this alienation as a crisis of meaning, a spiritual sickness that comes from losing connection to the deeper sources of life. He observed that modern people had become too identified with their conscious, rational minds, cutting themselves off from the unconscious, from the body, from nature, from the numinous dimension of existence. We became, in his view, one-sided, overdeveloped in our capacity for control and analysis, underdeveloped in our capacity for reception, for allowing, for surrender. He noted that people in traditional cultures had rituals, myths, and spiritual practices that regularly punctured the ego's inflation, reminding individuals of their place in a larger order, connecting them to forces beyond their personal will. Modern people, having largely abandoned these practices, find themselves alone with their egos, convinced of their autonomy, their self-sufficiency, their capacity to author their own lives. And then they come to Jung's consulting room, broken, lost, suffering from what he called a neurosis, which he often described as a substitute for legitimate suffering. What did he mean by this? He meant that when we refuse to face the legitimate suffering that is part of being human, the loss, the limitation, the uncertainty, the mortality, when we refuse to surrender to these difficult truths, we create substitute sufferings, neurotic symptoms that are the psyche's way of forcing the issue. The anxiety, the depression, the compulsions, the psychosomatic complaints. These are often the unconscious's way of demanding that we pay attention to what we've been avoiding, that we let go of the control strategies that have stopped working, that we surrender to a truth we've been resisting. Jung would say that the symptom is not the problem, but the attempted solution. It's the psyche's wisdom trying to break through the ego's rigid defenses, and the path to healing, he believed, was not to strengthen the ego's control, but to help it surrender to the wisdom of the self, that archetype of wholeness that encompasses both conscious and unconscious, both ego and shadow, both the known and the unknown dimensions of who you are. This surrendering to the self is not a one-time event, but a lifelong process. It requires developing what Jung called a religious attitude toward life, not religious, in the sense of adhering to a particular doctrine, but religious in the original sense of the word, religio, meaning to bind back, to reconnect, to remember your connection to something larger than your individual ego. For some, this larger something is God. For others, it's nature, or the cosmos, or the collective unconscious, or simply life itself. The name matters less than the recognition that you are not the center of the universe, that your will is not supreme, that there is a wisdom operating in existence that preceded you and will continue after you, and that your task is not to dominate this wisdom, but to align with it, to listen to it, to let it work through you. This is where many spiritual traditions converge. The Christian mystic Meister Eckhart spoke of Gelassenheit, a German word meaning releasement or letting be, a state of complete surrender to the divine will. He taught that the path to union with God required emptying oneself of self-will, creating a space for God to enter. Similarly, the Sufi poet Rumi wrote endlessly about the need to surrender the small self to the beloved, to die before you die, to let the ego dissolve in the ocean of divine love. In Buddhism, the concept of non-attachment points to a similar truth. Suffering, the Buddha taught, comes from clinging, from tanha, that desperate grasping at pleasure, at existence, at experiences we want to keep, and our frantic pushing away of experiences we want to avoid. Liberation comes through letting go, through recognizing the impermanent nature of all phenomena, through surrendering the illusion that we can hold on to anything in a universe characterized by constant change. The Hindu tradition speaks of surrender as bhakti, devotion, the offering of oneself to the divine. In the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna counsels the warrior Arjuna to perform his duty without attachment to the fruits of his action, to act from a place of surrender to Dharma, to the right order of things, rather than from ego-driven desire for particular outcomes. These traditions, arising from different times and places, all point toward the same essential insight. The path to peace, to freedom, to wholeness runs through surrender. Not surrender as defeat, but surrender as alignment. Not surrender as weakness, but surrender as the ultimate strength, the strength to let go of the exhausting pretense of control and trust in something deeper. But what does this look like in practice? How do you surrender in a world that demands you stay in control? How do you let go when everything in you has been trained to hold on? How do you trust in a deeper order when your mind keeps catastrophizing about all the terrible things that might happen if you stop managing every detail? It begins perhaps with small moments, with noticing the grip, with feeling in your body where you're holding tension, where you're bracing against what is, where you're clenching against reality. And then, just for a moment, you soften. You let the breath move through you without controlling it. You let the thoughts come and go without believing everyone. You let the feeling wash over you without immediately trying to fix it or make it go away. These small surrenders are practice. They're training the nervous system to tolerate the vulnerability of not being in control. Because that's what we're really afraid of, isn't it? Not the specific outcomes we're trying to prevent, but the feeling of vulnerability that comes when we admit we cannot prevent them. We'd rather exhaust ourselves with worry than feel the tender, exposed sensation of acknowledging our fundamental powerlessness over so much of life. But here's what's strange. When you actually allow yourself to feel that vulnerability, when you stop running from it, when you surrender to it, it transforms. The vulnerability doesn't destroy you. It opens you. It softens the hard shell you've built around your heart. It allows you to feel not just your own tenderness, but the tenderness of all beings, all of us navigating this uncertain existence. None of us ultimately in control, all of us doing our best with the light we have. This is where surrender becomes compassion. When you stop pretending you have it all together, you can finally meet others where they actually are, rather than where you think they should be. When you admit your own powerlessness, you can hold space for others' struggles without needing to fix them. When you surrender the illusion of your own perfection, you can embrace the beautiful imperfection of being human. Jung spoke about the shadow, those parts of ourselves we've rejected, denied, pushed into the unconscious because they don't fit our ego's image of who we should be. Integrating the shadow, bringing it back into consciousness, requires a profound surrender. It requires admitting that you're not who you've been pretending to be, that the persona you show the world is incomplete, that there are parts of you that are messy, selfish, angry, fearful, lustful, aggressive, weak. Most people resist this. They've invested so much in their identity as a good person, a successful person, a person who has it together. To acknowledge the shadow feels like it would destroy that identity. But Jung knew that this destruction is necessary for wholeness. The persona must die so the self can emerge. The false unity of the ego must shatter so the true unity of the integrated personality can be born. This shattering often comes through crisis, the dark night of the soul, as St. John of the Cross called it. The encounter with meaninglessness that Frankl wrote about. The descent into the underworld that mythology depicts as necessary for transformation. These are times when all your control strategies fail, when your usual ways of managing life collapse, when you're forced into a surrender you didn't choose. But crisis is not the only path. You can choose surrender before life forces it on you. You can practice it daily. You can make it a spiritual discipline, a conscious relinquishing of control, a deliberate opening to what is. This is what meditation is, at its core. Not a technique for achieving something, but a practice of allowing everything to be exactly as it is, including your own mind, your own thoughts, your own resistance to what is. When you sit in meditation, you notice how the mind wants to control the experience. It wants to have good meditation, not a bad one. It wants to be peaceful, not agitated. It wants to transcend, not be stuck in the mundane. And over time, you learn to let go of these preferences. You learn to surrender to whatever is arising, whether it's peace or agitation, clarity or confusion, transcendence or the most ordinary, human experience of discomfort and distraction. This surrender in meditation is practice for life, because life is exactly like this. It gives you what it gives you, not what you ordered. Your job is not to force it into compliance with your preferences, but to meet it as it is, to work with what arises, to find the freedom not in getting what you want, but in wanting what you get, in loving what is rather than pining for what isn't. This doesn't mean you become passive. It doesn't mean you stop having preferences or working toward goals or trying to create positive change in your life and in the world. But it means your action comes from a different place, not from desperate grasping or fearful resistance, but from a centered, grounded presence that responds to reality as it actually is, rather than reacting to your fantasies about how it should be. Think about the difference between reaction and response. Reaction is automatic, unconscious, driven by old patterns and conditioning. You react to criticism with defensiveness because that's your habit. You react to uncertainty with anxiety because that's your default. You react to loss with denial because you can't bear the pain. These reactions happen before you've consciously chosen them. They're survival mechanisms, ways your psyche learned long ago to protect itself. Response, on the other hand, requires space. It requires a gap between stimulus and action, and that gap is created by surrender. When you surrender the need to react immediately, when you let go of the compulsion to defend or attack or fix or flee, you create space for something new to emerge, a response that comes from presence rather than pattern, an action that comes from wisdom rather than wound. This is what Viktor Frankl meant when he wrote, "Between stimulus and response there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. But you can only access that space through a kind of surrender, a letting go of the reactive patterns that normally fill it." Frankl learned this in the concentration camps, perhaps the most extreme environment of powerlessness imaginable. He couldn't control his circumstances. He couldn't prevent his suffering. He couldn't save his loved ones. What he could do, what no one could take from him, was his attitude toward his experience. He could surrender to the reality of his situation while refusing to surrender his dignity, his meaning, his humanity. This is the crucial distinction. Surrendering to reality doesn't mean surrendering to evil. It doesn't mean accepting abuse or injustice or harm. It means seeing clearly what is so that you can respond effectively. When you're in denial about reality, when you're resisting what is, You can't act wisely because you're not dealing with the situation as it actually exists. You're fighting with your mental image of how things should be rather than engaging with how things are. Frankl surrendered to the reality that he was in a concentration camp. He didn't pretend otherwise. He didn't spend his energy raging against the injustice, though the injustice was absolute. Instead, he used his limited energy to find meaning, to help others, to preserve his inner freedom. And this surrender to what he couldn't control paradoxically gave him access to a power that his captors, for all their brutality, couldn't touch. This is the power you find when you surrender, not the power to control external circumstances, which was always an illusion, but the power to choose your relationship to those circumstances, the power to decide what they mean, the power to determine who you'll be in the midst of them, the power to preserve your essential nature even when everything non-essential is stripped away. Jung called this the transcendent function, the psyche's capacity to create a third option beyond the ego's usual binary of control or collapse. When you can't control something and you won't collapse under it, what emerges is transcendence, a new way of being that includes both the reality of powerlessness and the reality of inner sovereignty. This transcendent function is activated through surrender, through letting go of the ego's demand for certainty, for security, for control, through trusting that the psyche has resources beyond what the conscious mind can access, through faith, not necessarily in a religious sense, but in the sense of fidelity to your own becoming, trust in the process of your unfolding, even when you can't see where it's leading. Think about metamorphosis. The caterpillar doesn't know it's going to become a butterfly. When it enters the chrysalis, it doesn't have a plan. It doesn't maintain control over the process. It surrenders completely. It literally dissolves, its body breaking down into an undifferentiated cellular soup before reorganizing into an entirely new form. If the caterpillar could think, it would experience this as death. It would resist. It would try to hold on to being a caterpillar. But because it can't resist, because surrender is built into its nature, transformation happens. You are not so different. There are times in your life when you're called to dissolve, to let go of the form you've taken, to surrender to a transformation you cannot understand or control. The end of adolescence, the beginning of parenthood, the loss of a loved one, the collapse of a career, the diagnosis of an illness, the confrontation with mortality. These are chrysalis moments, thresholds where the old form is no longer viable and the new form hasn't yet emerged. In these moments, you have a choice. You can resist, cling to what was, try to force yourself back into a form that no longer fits. This resistance creates suffering, or you can surrender. You can let yourself dissolve. You can trust that this dissolution is not destruction, but transformation, that on the other side of this darkness there is a new form waiting to emerge, one you cannot imagine from where you currently stand. This trust is not easy. It requires what the poet John Keats called negative capability, the capacity to remain in uncertainty, mystery and doubt, without irritably reaching after fact and reason. It requires tolerance for ambiguity, for not knowing, for the void. And our minds hate the void. They want answers, explanations, plans. They want to fill the emptiness with something, anything, even if it's worry or rumination or obsessive planning that goes nowhere. But the void is sacred. It's the womb of creation. It's the space where the new can emerge. When you surrender to it instead of frantically trying to fill it, you discover that it's not empty at all. It's full of potential, pregnant with possibility, alive with a creative intelligence that far exceeds your conscious understanding. The mystics knew this. They spoke of the cloud of unknowing, the via negativa, the path of negation, where you approach the divine not by knowing more but by unknowing, by surrendering your concepts and certainties and opening to mystery. They spoke of the dark night of the soul not as a problem to be solved, but as a threshold to be crossed, a necessary passage from one way of being to another. Meister Eckhart taught that God is found not through addition but through subtraction, not by gaining qualities, but by releasing attachments. He spoke of the need to become empty, to create within yourself a desert, a wasteland where God could enter. This emptying is surrender. It's the release of everything you thought made you who you are, so that you can discover who you are beyond all those identifications. The Buddhist tradition has a similar teaching in the concept of shunyata, emptiness. Not emptiness as nihilistic void, but emptiness as the ground of being, the spacious awareness that contains all phenomena, but is identified with none of them. To realize this emptiness requires surrender, the progressive letting go of all the things you take yourself to be, your roles, your stories, your beliefs, your personality, until you rest in the awareness that precedes and pervades all of these temporary forms. This is radical surrender. And it's terrifying to the ego, because the ego is constructed entirely of those temporary forms. It is your roles, your stories, your beliefs, your personality. To surrender them feels like annihilation. But what the spiritual traditions teach is that you are not the ego. You are the awareness in which the ego appears. And when you surrender the identification with ego, you don't disappear. You discover what you really are, what you've always been, what you could never not be. This discovery is not a one-time event. It's a continual surrender, a daily dying, a perpetual letting go, because the ego keeps reconstructing itself. You have a moment of spacious awareness, of freedom from identification, and then the mind contracts again around a thought, a worry, a story, and you have to surrender again, and again, and again. This is why spiritual practice is called practice, not because you're preparing for some future state of perfection, but because you're practicing the gesture of surrender over and over until it becomes more natural than grasping, more familiar than control. You're retraining your nervous system, rewiring your brain, creating new grooves for your energy to flow through. Neuroscience confirms what the contemplatives have always known. The brain is plastic, constantly changing based on what you practice. If you practice worry, you get better at worrying. If you practice control, you strengthen the neural networks associated with anxiety and vigilance. But if you practice surrender, if you practice letting go, if you practice releasing tension and opening to what is, you create new pathways, new possibilities, new default modes of being. This is hopeful. It means you're not stuck with the patterns you inherited or developed. Change is possible, but it requires practice. Conscious, repeated, patient practice of the very thing your conditioning tells you not to do, which is to let go, to surrender, to trust. And here's what you discover when you practice this. Surrender doesn't lead to the catastrophes you feared. Life doesn't fall apart when you stop trying to hold it together. In fact, often the opposite happens. Things flow more smoothly. Opportunities appear. Solutions emerge that you couldn't have planned. Relationships deepen. Creative ideas flow. You feel more alive, more present, more yourself than you did when you were exhausted from the effort of control. This is because you're no longer working against life. You're working with it. You're flowing like the river instead of trying to push the river. You're dancing with reality instead of fighting it. And reality, it turns out, is a remarkably good dance partner when you stop stepping on its toes. But let's be honest, there are times when surrender doesn't feel like dancing, times when it feels like drowning, times when letting go doesn't lead to peace, but to panic, times when surrendering control plunges you into fear so primal that every cell in your body is screaming at you to grab hold of something, anything, to keep from being swept away. These moments are real. The fear is real. And here's where surrender becomes truly radical, because the ultimate surrender is not just surrendering to the pleasant things, the peaceful things, the things that feel good and safe. It's surrendering to the fear itself. It's letting yourself feel the panic without trying to make it stop. It's being willing to drown, metaphorically speaking, to let the wave take you under, trusting that you'll surface again. This is what Rumi meant in his poem, The Guest House. He invites you to welcome all visitors to the guest house of your being. even the dark thought, the shame, the malice, even if they arrive as a crowd of sorrows who violently sweep your house empty. Treat each guest honorably, he says, because each has been sent as a guide from beyond. Surrendering to the difficult emotions, the uncomfortable truths, the painful realities you've been avoiding. This is the surrender that transforms. Not the surrender that comes easily when life is smooth, but the surrender that comes hard when everything in you wants to resist. When you're grieving and you want to deny. When you're sick and you want to pretend you're not. When you're afraid and you want to collapse into distraction. To surrender in these moments means to feel what you feel without making it worse by fighting it, without adding suffering on top of pain by telling yourself you shouldn't feel this way, that there's something wrong with you for not being able to control your emotional state. The feeling itself is difficult enough. The resistance to the feeling is what makes it unbearable. This is the essence of the Buddhist teaching on the two arrows. The first arrow is the pain that life brings, the inevitable suffering of loss, illness, aging, death. The second arrow is the suffering we create by resisting the first arrow, by telling ourselves this shouldn't be happening, by trying to make reality other than it is. We can't avoid the first arrow, but we can stop shooting ourselves with the second one, and we do that through surrender, through acceptance, through allowing what is to be what is. This acceptance is not resignation. It's not saying, I give up. Nothing will ever change. I'm stuck in misery forever. It's saying, right now, in this moment, this is what is happening, and I can be with this. I can allow this to be true without collapsing or resisting. I can feel this feeling, acknowledge this reality, and trust that I have the capacity to bear it. And you do have that capacity. You've borne everything life has given you so far. You're still here. The experiences you were certain would destroy you didn't destroy you. The losses you thought you couldn't survive, you survived. The pain you believed was unbearable, you bore. You've been practicing surrender your whole life without realizing it. Every time you made it through something difficult, every time you adapted to a change you didn't choose, every time you kept going when you wanted to give up. The difference now is to make it conscious, to recognize that this capacity to bear what comes, to flow with change, to let go and trust, this is not a weakness, but your deepest strength. It's the strength that doesn't come from resisting life, but from embracing it. The strength that doesn't try to be stronger than reality, but recognizes that reality itself is the ground you stand on. The only ground there is, and it will hold you if you let it. Jung wrote about the importance of suffering in the individuation process, not seeking suffering for its own sake, but recognizing that certain truths can only be learned through difficulty, that certain depths can only be reached through descent, that certain transformations require you to go through the fire rather than around it. When you surrender to necessary suffering, when you stop running from it or trying to numb yourself to it, you discover that it's not meaningless. It's teaching you something. It's initiating you into a deeper way of being. This is why traditional cultures had initiation rites, ceremonies that deliberately created suffering, ordeals that pushed initiates to their limits. These weren't sadistic rituals. They were recognition that you cannot cross certain thresholds without experiencing a kind of death and rebirth. The boy cannot become a man without the death of boyhood. The uninitiated cannot become initiated without the death of innocence. The old self cannot give way to the new without dissolution. Modern culture has largely abandoned these rites of passage, and we suffer for their absence. We have no containers for the transitions we must make, no guidance for the surrenders required at each life stage. We're expected to figure it out on our own, to maintain composure through experiences that deserve to shatter us, to keep functioning through transformations that require us to fall apart. And so people create their own initiations, often unconsciously, the addiction that brings you to your knees, the breakdown that forces you to rebuild, the crisis that dismantles everything you thought you knew. These are the psyche's way of initiating you when culture has failed to provide the structure. They're forcing the surrender you've been avoiding, creating the death and rebirth that's necessary for your development. If you can recognize this, if you can see the pattern, you can work with it consciously instead of being dragged through it unconsciously. You can surrender before the crisis becomes catastrophic. You can let go before you're forced to. You can choose the death of the false self rather than having it violently ripped away. This choosing of surrender is the ultimate act of freedom, because you're not a victim of circumstances when you meet them willingly. You're not powerless when you acknowledge your powerlessness. You're not weak when you admit you can't hold on anymore. You're awake. You're conscious. You're participating in your own transformation rather than being transformed against your will. There's a story from the Desert Fathers, those early Christian mystics who retreated to the wilderness to pursue union with God. A young monk goes to an elder and asks, "What must I do to be saved?" The elder takes him to his cell and shows him a basket of bread. "Take this bread," the elder says, "and throw it out the window." The young monk is confused. "But that's wasteful. That's good bread." The elder replies, "Only when you can throw away the bread will you understand what I'm teaching. The bread is everything you're clinging to, your possessions, your relationships, your ideas, your identity, your life itself. Not that you should literally throw these things away, but you must be willing to. You must hold them loosely enough that if life asks you to release them, you can. Because everything you possess, you will eventually lose. Everything you love, you will eventually be separated from. Everything you are, you will eventually cease to be, at least in the form you currently take. This is not pessimism, it's realism. It's the first noble truth of Buddhism, that all conditioned existence is characterized by impermanence and unsatisfactoriness, and the freedom comes not from denying this truth, but from surrendering to it, from living in full acknowledgement that nothing lasts, and therefore nothing can be ultimately grasped. And therefore, you might as well open your hands now. When you open your hands, when you stop grasping, you discover something extraordinary. Life is still there, the love is still there, the beauty is still there. But now you can experience it without the anxiety of trying to hold on to it. You can enjoy the sunset without grieving that it's fading. You can love the person without desperately trying to prevent them from changing. You can be yourself without clinging to a fixed idea of who that self must be. This is the freedom of surrender. Not freedom from life, but freedom in life. Not escape from experience, but full participation in it. Undefended, unarmored, utterly vulnerable, and therefore utterly alive. Because when you're defending yourself, when you're controlling and managing and protecting yourself from life, you're also cutting yourself off from it. You can't let the good in without risking the bad. You can't open to joy without becoming vulnerable to sorrow. So you have to choose. Do you want safety or aliveness? Control or connection? The fortress or the dance? You can't have both. The fortress protects you, yes, but it also imprisons you. The walls that keep pain out also keep love out. The strategies that shield you from uncertainty also shield you from wonder. The control that prevents disappointment also prevents delight. Surrender is the choice to leave the fortress, to lower the drawbridge, to walk out unarmed into the world and let it touch you, to let life in all its terrible beauty break your heart open over and over again, to let love in even though you know you'll lose it, to create even though you know it won't be perfect, to try even though you know you might fail, to live fully even though you know it will end. This is courage, true courage. Not the courage that doesn't feel fear, but the courage that feels the fear and surrenders to it anyway. Not the courage that conquers and dominates, but the courage that yields and opens. The courage to be soft in a hard world. The courage to be tender when everything around you is telling you to be tough. The courage to trust when you have every reason not to. And where does this courage come from? Not from the ego. The ego is brave in its own way, but its bravery is always in service of protecting itself, maintaining itself, aggrandizing itself. True courage comes from a deeper place. It comes from the self, from that center of your being that knows it cannot be destroyed because it was never merely personal to begin with. It comes from your connection to something larger than yourself, whether you call that God or nature or the Tao or simply life. When you feel held by something larger, you can let go. When you trust that you're part of a web of being that extends far beyond your individual existence, you can release your grip on your particular strand of it. When you know, really know in your bones, that you're not separate from life, but an expression of it, a wave in its ocean, then the wave can crash on the shore without the tragedy of believing it has been destroyed. The wave returns to the ocean which it never actually left. This is the ultimate surrender, the surrender of the illusion of separateness, the recognition that the boundary you thought existed between you and the world, between subject and object, between self and other, is not as solid as it seems, that you are not a separate thing defending itself against other things, but a process, a pattern of energy and information continuous with all the other processes, all the other patterns. Modern physics confirms what the mystics have always taught. At the quantum level, there are no separate objects. There are only relationships, interactions, fields of probability collapsing into manifestation when observed. The universe is not made of things, but of happenings. And you are not a thing, but a happening, an event in the larger unfolding of reality. When you know this, really know it, not just intellectually but experientially, surrender becomes natural. Because what are you defending? What are you controlling? What are you trying to protect from what? The boundaries dissolve. The sense of being a separate self in an alien universe gives way to the recognition of being the universe experiencing itself through this particular form. This is what the Hindu tradition means by the phrase Tat Tvamasi, thou art that. You are not separate from the ultimate reality. You are it. The divine is not something outside you that you must please or obey or surrender to. It is your deepest nature, and surrender is simply the recognition of this, the return to what you've always been. But let me be clear, this recognition doesn't make your individual life meaningless. It doesn't mean your choices don't matter, or that you should become passive. The wave is still a wave, even though it's made of ocean. You are still you, even though you're made of the same substance as everything else. Your particular form matters. Your unique expression matters. The way life is being itself through you matters. Surrender doesn't erase your individuality. It contextualizes it. It helps you see that your individual self is not the whole story, that there's a larger self, a universal self, and your job is to allow that larger self to express through you, to let your life be an offering, a gift, a unique note in the grand symphony of existence. This is what it means to surrender your will to divine will, not in the sense of abandoning your will, but in the sense of aligning it with the deeper intelligence that animates all life. Your will becomes an instrument of that intelligence rather than a rebel against it. You stop trying to impose your agenda on reality and start listening for reality's agenda, trusting that it's wiser, more comprehensive, more loving than anything your limited perspective could conceive. And this is where the paradox deepens. Because when you surrender your will, when you let go of your agenda, you often find that your deepest desires are fulfilled, not always in the way you planned, not always in the timing you preferred, but in ways more beautiful and surprising than you could have imagined. It's as if the universe has been waiting for you to stop forcing, stop grasping, stop insisting, so it can give you what you actually need, which is often different from what you thought you wanted. There's a story of a man who spends his life climbing a ladder, certain that happiness waits at the top. He climbs and climbs, sacrificing everything for the ascent. Finally exhausted, he reaches the top, only to discover the ladder was leaning against the wrong wall. This is the tragedy of a life lived without surrender, a life where you achieve your goals only to realize they weren't worth achieving, where you get what you wanted only to discover it doesn't satisfy. Surrender prevents this tragedy, because when you're surrendered, you're not rigidly fixated on one particular ladder, one particular wall. You're responsive to the feedback life gives you. You're willing to change course when you realize you're headed in the wrong direction. You're open to discovering that the treasure you thought was at the top of the mountain is actually buried at the base, that the answer you thought required great complexity is actually simple, that the person you thought you needed to become is less authentic than the person you already are beneath all the striving. This responsiveness, this flexibility, this willingness to change, this is the water nature that Taoism praises. Water is soft, yielding, receptive, and yet it's the most powerful force on earth. Over time, it wears down the hardest stone. It finds its way around any obstacle. It takes the shape of whatever container it's poured into, without losing its essential nature. You can be like water, soft but powerful, yielding but persistent, adaptable but true to your nature. But only if you surrender the rigidity, the hardness, the insistence on your way. Only if you're willing to flow, to change, to let yourself be shaped by the container of your life, rather than constantly fighting to reshape the container. And yes, sometimes the container is painful. Sometimes life pours you into a form that hurts, a situation you didn't choose, a reality you can't accept. And still, the invitation is to surrender, not to become less than yourself, but to become flexible enough to inhabit even this difficult shape without breaking, to find how to be yourself even here, especially here, in the place you least want to be. This is the wisdom of the wounded healer archetype that Jung wrote about. The healer is not someone who has never been wounded, but someone who has been wounded, and, rather than hardening against the pain, has surrendered to it, has let it break them open, has allowed the wound to become a source of compassion and understanding, rather than bitterness and defensiveness. Your wounds, when you surrender to them rather than resist them, become your medicine. The very thing that broke you becomes what makes you whole. The suffering you tried so hard to avoid becomes the doorway to a depth of being you couldn't have accessed any other way. The surrender you feared would destroy you becomes the birth canal through which your truest self emerges. This is the alchemy of surrender. Lead into gold, death into life, defeat into victory, though not the kind of victory the ego was seeking. The ego wanted to win by conquering. The self wins by surrendering. The ego wanted to be special, superior, set apart. The self discovers its specialness precisely in its ordinariness, its connection to all beings who suffer, all beings who struggle, all beings who must eventually let go. In this recognition of shared humanity, shared fragility, shared mortality, there is a profound intimacy. You're not alone in your vulnerability. Everyone is vulnerable. Everyone is trying to control the uncontrollable. Everyone is afraid. Everyone is mortal. And when you surrender your defenses enough to let yourself see and be seen in this vulnerability, when you let yourself need and be needed, when you let yourself love and grieve and fear and hope alongside every other human who has ever lived, you discover what you were actually seeking all along underneath the drive for control. You are seeking connection, belonging, the felt sense of being part of something larger than yourself. And you can't have that while you're defended, while you're pretending to have it all together, while you're hiding behind the mask of competence and control. True connection requires surrender, the surrender of the persona, the surrender of the pretense, the surrender of the exhausting performance of being someone you're not. And when you risk this surrender, when you let someone see you without the mask, something miraculous happens. They become more real to you, and you become more real to them. The persona-to-persona interaction gives way to a genuine meeting, self to self, soul to soul. And in that meeting, you're not diminished by being known. You're fulfilled. Because to be truly known, seen, witnessed in your full complexity, your shadow and your light, your strength and your weakness, and to be loved anyway, or even more, to be loved because of all of it, this is the deepest food for the soul. But you have to surrender the control of how you're perceived. You have to risk being seen as less than perfect. You have to let go of the image you've crafted and let people encounter the truth of you. And yes, some people will reject that truth. They were in relationship with the image, not with you, and when the image is gone, the relationship can't sustain itself. This loss is painful but necessary. It's the pruning that allows for new growth, because the relationships built on persona are exhausting to maintain and ultimately unsatisfying. They require you to constantly monitor yourself, to edit your expression, to hide parts of yourself to remain acceptable. This is not intimacy. This is isolation, disguised as connection. True intimacy requires surrender, mutual surrender. Both people lowering their defenses enough to see and be seen. Both people releasing the need to impress or perform and risking the vulnerability of just being. This kind of intimacy is rare because it's terrifying, but it's also the most nourishing thing a human being can experience. Jung understood this. He wrote about the conjunctio, the sacred union that happens not just between people, but within the psyche when the opposites come together. Masculine and feminine, conscious and unconscious, light and shadow. This inner marriage requires surrender. The conscious ego must surrender its dominance and enter into relationship with the unconscious. Neither can rule. They must learn to dance together, each informing the other, each tempering the other's excesses. When this inner union is achieved, even partially, it radiates outward. Your relationships become healthier because you're not projecting your unlived parts onto other people and demanding they carry them for you. You're not looking for someone to complete you because you're learning to become complete within yourself. And paradoxically, this makes you more available for real relationship because you're not coming from a place of desperate need, but from a place of wholeness seeking to share itself. This is the surrender that creates sovereignty. Not the sovereignty of control, of being above or beyond life, but the sovereignty of being fully yourself, integrated, authentic, no longer at war with your own nature. This sovereignty is not threatened by life's challenges because it's not based on external circumstances. It's rooted in something deeper, something that can't be touched by the changing winds of fortune. The Stoics understood this. They taught that the only thing truly within your control is your character, your virtue, the use you make of your impressions. Everything else, your health, your wealth, your reputation, your relationships, even your life itself, these are not truly yours to control. They're on loan from fate. They can be taken at any moment. So don't base your well-being on them. Base it on something that can't be taken. Your capacity to respond with wisdom, with courage, with justice, with moderation. This sounds like control, and in a sense it is, but it's a different kind of control. It's not control over externals, but mastery of internals, and it requires surrender. Surrender of the belief that you should be able to control everything. Surrender of the attachment to outcomes. Surrender of the demand that life be fair, comfortable, or comprehensible. When you surrender these things, what remains is your freedom to choose your character regardless of circumstances. This is the freedom that Frankl found in the concentration camps, the freedom to choose your attitude, the freedom to find meaning even in suffering, the freedom to love even when love seems futile. This freedom is paradoxically discovered through surrender. When you surrender the demand that life be other than it is, you become free to fully inhabit life as it is. And this is where surrender becomes a kind of joy, not happiness, which depends on circumstances, but joy, which arises from a deep acceptance of existence itself. Joy is what you feel when you stop fighting, when you let yourself be carried by the current of life, rather than constantly swimming against it. Joy is the natural state of a being that is aligned with its own nature and with the nature of reality. Children have this joy naturally. They haven't yet learned to resist what is. They surrender to their experience completely. When they're happy, they're completely happy. When they're sad, they're completely sad. There's no holding back, no self-consciousness, no worry about whether they should be feeling what they're feeling. They're just present, surrendered to the moment. And then we socialize them out of this. We teach them to control their emotions, to moderate their expression, to think before they feel. And these skills have value. We need some capacity for self-regulation to function in society. But somewhere along the way, many people lose touch with that spontaneous joy, that capacity to surrender completely to the moment. They become so controlled, so defended, so managed that life becomes a performance rather than an experience. The path back to joy requires unlearning. It requires surrendering the controls you've built, the defenses you've erected, the rules you've internalized about how you should be. It requires giving yourself permission to be as you are, to feel what you feel, to want what you want, even when it doesn't make sense, even when it's not appropriate, even when you think you should want something else. This doesn't mean acting on every impulse. You still have responsibility, you still have ethics, but it means being honest with yourself about what's actually happening inside you, rather than censoring it before you've even acknowledged it. Because when you can't acknowledge your truth, you can't work with it. You're at the mercy of forces you won't admit exist. Shadow work, that Jungian process of bringing the unconscious into consciousness, requires this kind of surrender. You have to be willing to see parts of yourself you've been avoiding, to admit to desires and fears and impulses you've labeled unacceptable, to recognize that you're more complex, more contradictory, more fully human than your ego's carefully curated self-image allows. This is humbling, and humility is a form of surrender. It's the surrender of the inflated ego that thinks it's better than it is, more in control than it is, more evolved than it is. Humility brings you back to earth, back to your humanity, back to the truth that you're a work in progress, a mixture of light and dark, wisdom and foolishness, strength and weakness. And there's relief in this. When you stop pretending to be perfect, you can finally relax. When you admit you don't have it all figured out, you can stop exhausting yourself trying to maintain that facade. When you acknowledge that you're struggling, you can ask for help. When you accept that you're human, you can start to enjoy being human, rather than seeing it as a problem to transcend. This acceptance, this surrender to your humanity, is the ground from which real growth happens. Not growth in the sense of escaping your nature, but growth in the sense of becoming more fully yourself, more integrated, more whole. The acorn doesn't become an oak by trying to be something other than an acorn. It becomes an oak by surrendering to its own nature, by allowing the intelligence inherent in its being to unfold according to its inherent design. You have an inherent design too, a telos, as the Greeks called it, a purpose built into your nature, and you discover it not by imposing some foreign ideal on yourself, but by surrendering to what wants to emerge from within you, by listening, by paying attention, by noticing what brings you alive, what makes time disappear, what feels like coming home. This is the voice of the self in Jungian terms, the organizing principle of the psyche that knows what you're meant to become and is constantly trying to guide you toward it. But the ego often can't hear this voice because it's so loud with its own agenda, its own plans, its own ideas about who you should be. Surrender quiets the ego enough to hear the self. It creates space for the still, small voice to be heard. And sometimes what it says is surprising. Sometimes it guides you in directions you never would have chosen, into situations you never would have sought, through experiences you would have avoided if you could. But looking back, you can see that these were exactly the experiences you needed, that they brought you gifts you couldn't have received any other way, that they shaped you into someone you couldn't have become through. Comfort alone. This is the providence that religious people speak of, the sense that there's an intelligence guiding your life towards some end that's wiser than your conscious goals. You don't have to believe in a personal God to sense this. You can simply notice the pattern, the way doors close and other doors open, the way what seemed like disaster turns out to be necessary, the way what you thought you needed turns out to be less important than what you actually received. When you surrender to this pattern, when you trust it, you stop fighting so hard. You let yourself be guided. You follow the thread of your genuine interest, your authentic desire, your deepest calling, even when it doesn't make logical sense, even when you can't see where it's leading, even when other people think you're crazy. This is the surrender of living your own life rather than the life others expect of you. It's the surrender of the collective's values in favor of your own. It's the surrender of fitting in favor of being true, and it costs something. You might disappoint people, you might be judged, you might be alone for a while, but you'll be free. Free to discover who you actually are rather than who you've been trying to be. Jung called this process individuation, and he saw it as the central task of the second half of life. In the first half, you build an ego, establish yourself in the world, take on roles and responsibilities. In the second half, if you're willing, you dismantle the rigid structures you built and discover who you are beyond those structures. You surrender the persona and encounter the self. But this doesn't have to wait until midlife. You can begin at any age. You can begin now, the moment you recognize that you've been living according to a script you didn't write. You can choose differently. You can surrender the script. You can improvise. You can trust yourself to meet each moment fresh, rather than relying on old patterns and conditioning. This trust is faith. Not faith in a doctrine, but faith as an orientation toward reality, a basic confidence that life is trustworthy, that you are held, that you can let go. And where does this faith come from? Sometimes from religion, sometimes from a mystical experience, sometimes from hitting bottom and discovering you survived, sometimes from small moments of grace that accumulate until you can't help but notice there's something benevolent at work in existence. For me, it came through a combination of things: books that cracked open my worldview, meditation that gave me glimpses of a wider reality, suffering that broke me down and rebuilt me differently, relationships that showed me I could be known and still loved, nature that reminded me I'm part of something vast and beautiful. All of these created a gradual shift from seeing the universe as indifferent or hostile to seeing it as, at minimum, neutral, and at best, somehow on my side. This shift doesn't happen through logic. You can't think your way into it. It's experiential. It comes through surrender, through the repeated experience of letting go and discovering you're okay, of trusting and finding that trust warranted, of opening and experiencing grace flowing through the opening. Grace is a religious word, but the experience it points to is universal. It's the experience of receiving something you didn't earn, couldn't control, and don't deserve. Yet there it is anyway, a moment of unexpected beauty, a kindness from a stranger, a synchronicity that seems too perfect to be random, a healing that medicine can't explain, an insight that arrives fully formed, a love that finds you when you'd given up looking. These moments of grace are invitations to surrender, to let go of the belief that you're alone, that you have to do everything yourself, that it's all up to you. They're hints that you're participating in something larger than your individual will, that you're being supported in ways you can't see, that the universe is more interested in your well-being than you dared imagine. But you have to be open to receive grace, and that openness is surrender. The closed fist can't receive, the defended heart can't be touched, the controlling mind can't be surprised by beauty. Surrender creates the space for grace to enter, for life to give you what you need, for your deepest prayers to be answered, not always as you expected, but as you most truly need. Prayer itself is a form of surrender when done authentically. Not prayer as bargaining with God or trying to manipulate outcomes, but prayer as opening, as offering, as acknowledging that you need help, that you can't do this alone, that you're willing to receive guidance from a source beyond your ego. Even if you're not religious, you can pray in this sense. You can ask the universe or life or your highest self, show me the way, help me see what I can't see, guide me toward what's true. And then you have to surrender to the answer, even when it comes in a form you don't like, even when it asks you to do something difficult, even when it contradicts what you thought you wanted. This is where many people fail. They ask for guidance, but then ignore it when it arrives because it's not what they hope to hear. They pray for change, but resist the very changes that would set them free. True surrender means being willing to follow where you're led, even into the darkness, even into the unknown, even into the death of who you've been. Because that death is the price of rebirth. You can't become who you're meant to be while clinging to who you are. Something has to be released. Something has to die. And the ego will fight this death with everything it has, because to the ego, it's not a metaphor. It feels like actual annihilation. This is why spiritual transformation often feels like crisis. The dark night of the soul, the descent into the underworld, the dismemberment of Osiris, the crucifixion before the resurrection. Every tradition has imagery for this necessary dissolution, this death that precedes new life. And every tradition teaches that you must surrender to it, that trying to avoid it only prolongs the agony, that the way out is through. So when you find yourself in that dark place, when life has stripped away everything you thought you were, when the old forms have collapsed and the new hasn't yet emerged, remember that this is sacred ground. This is the place of transformation. This is where surrender becomes most necessary and most powerful. You can't think your way out. You can't control your way through. You can only feel what you feel, grieve what you've lost, sit in the darkness and trust, even when you have no evidence to support that trust, that this night will end, that morning will come, that you will be reborn. And you will. Because life always continues. Death is always followed by new life. Winter always gives way to spring. This is the pattern woven into the fabric of existence. Surrender to it. Trust it. Let yourself be carried by it. You don't have to know where you're going. You don't have to understand what's happening. You just have to keep breathing, keep feeling, keep opening, keep surrendering to what is, moment by moment, breath by breath, until gradually, so gradually you might not even notice at first, the light returns. And when it does, you're different. You've been transformed by what you've been through. The person who emerges from the dark night is not the same person who entered it. Something false has been burned away. Something true has been revealed. You're more yourself than you were before, more authentic, more grounded, more real, and you're also more humble, because you've learned through direct experience that you're not in control, that life has its own intelligence, its own rhythm, its own purposes, and your job is not to dominate it, but to dance with it. This humility is not weakness, it's wisdom, it's the recognition of reality as it actually is, rather than as you wish it to be. And from this recognition, right action becomes possible, not the frantic action of the ego trying to control outcomes, but the aligned action of a being moving in harmony with the deeper currents of life, doing what's yours to do, in the way only you can do it, and then releasing the results, surrendering the outcome, trusting that your contribution is part of a larger weaving you can't fully see. This is how to live in the world without being destroyed by it, to act without attachment, to care deeply while holding loosely, to give your all while knowing that all is not yours to give, but is given through you. You become a vessel, a channel, an instrument, and there's freedom in this, because you're no longer bearing the crushing weight of thinking everything depends on you. You're part of something larger, and you're trusting that larger something to work through you and through everything else to bring about what needs to be. This trust is the fruit of surrender. And it's what allows you to rest finally, to lay down the burden of constant striving, to stop the endless efforting, to simply be, being rather than doing, presence rather than performance, acceptance rather than achievement. These are the gifts of surrender, and they're available to you right now, in this moment, if you're willing to let go. Let go of the story that you're not enough. Let go of the fear that you'll fail. Let go of the need to have it all figured out. Let go of the demand that life be fair. Let go of the anger at what was done to you. Let go of the guilt for what you've done. Let go of the fantasy of who you should be, and embrace the reality of who you are. Let go of control and discover what was always beyond your control, which is everything, including the fact that you're here, breathing, aware, alive, participating in this grand mystery of existence. You didn't choose to be born. You don't control when you'll die. Between these two moments, you have some degree of agency, some capacity to shape your experience, but far less than you think. Most of what happens to you is determined by forces beyond your control. Genetics, circumstances, other people's choices, random chance, the complex interplay of causes and conditions that brought you to this exact moment reading these exact words. And yet, within this web of causality, there is freedom. The freedom to choose your relationship to what happens. The freedom to find meaning in any circumstance. The freedom to love even when it's not reciprocated. The freedom to create even when it won't be recognized. The freedom to be kind even when kindness isn't returned. The freedom to surrender to what is while simultaneously working to bring about what could be. This is the ultimate paradox of surrender. It doesn't make you passive, it makes you effective, because you're no longer wasting energy on resistance, on resentment, on wishing things were different than they are. You see clearly what is, you accept it, and from that acceptance, you act. Not reactive action born from resistance, but responsive action born from wisdom. Not action meant to control outcomes, but action offered as gift, as contribution, as expression of who you are and what you value. This is karma yoga, the yoga of action that the Bhagavad Gita teaches. Performing your duty, your dharma, without attachment to the fruits of your action. Doing what's yours to do because it's yours to do, not because you're guaranteed success or recognition or reward. Offering your action as worship, as service, as participation in the great work of existence, and then letting it go, surrendering the results to forces beyond your control. When you live this way, you're free. Free from the anxiety of needing to succeed, free from the disappointment of failure, free from the endless comparison with others, free from the exhausting need to prove your worth. You act from fullness rather than lack, from love rather than fear, from being rather than becoming. And this doesn't mean you stop growing. Surrender is not stagnation. You're still evolving, still learning, still becoming more of who you are. But you're not becoming in order to finally be acceptable. You're already acceptable. You're becoming because that's what life does. It evolves, it unfolds, it expresses new possibilities. And your life expressing itself through this particular form, and surrender means allowing that expression, trusting it, getting out of its way. Getting out of your own way might be the most practical definition of surrender. Noticing how you interfere with your own flow, how you block your own blessings, how you sabotage your own success, how you resist your own joy. And then, gradually, with patience and compassion for yourself, learning to step aside, to let yourself be moved by something deeper than your conscious will, to trust your intuition, to follow your curiosity, to say yes to what enlivens you, and no to what deadens you. This is how you become yourself. Not by trying to be someone you're not, but by surrendering to who you already are beneath all the conditioning, all the shoulds, all the fears. That person has been there all along, waiting for you to stop trying so hard, waiting for you to let go, waiting for you to surrender. And when you finally do, when you let yourself be who you are without apology or explanation, something shifts in the whole field around you. People respond differently, opportunities appear, synchronicities multiply. It's as if the universe was waiting too, waiting for you to step into your authenticity so it could support you in it. Because an authentic human is serving the whole in a way that an artificial one never can. The unique note you're here to sound, no one else can sound it, and the symphony is incomplete until you do. So surrender, let go, trust. Not trust that everything will work out the way you want, but trust that everything will work out the way it needs to. Trust that you're held. Trust that you're guided. Trust that your life has meaning even when you can't see it. Trust that your suffering is not wasted. Trust that your joy is not frivolous. Trust that you are exactly where you need to be, learning exactly what you need to learn, becoming exactly who you need to become. This trust is not naive. It's hard-won through experience, through surrendering and discovering you survived, through letting go and finding you received, through dying 1,000 small deaths and being reborn each time a little more yourself, a little more whole, a little more free. Each surrender is practice for the final surrender, the one that will eventually be required when your body gives out and you release your grip on life itself. But if you've been practicing all along, if you've been surrendering daily to what is, then that final surrender won't be the first time. It will be the culmination of a lifetime of letting go. And perhaps it won't feel like defeat, but like homecoming, like finally relaxing completely, like the ultimate relief of releasing every burden you've carried and discovering what remains when everything temporary falls away. What remains is what you've always been, consciousness itself, awareness, the witness, the self that Jung pointed to, the Atman that is Brahman, the Buddha nature, the divine spark. Call it what you will, it's what's reading these words right now, what's been present through every experience of your life, what was never born and will never die. It's what you are beyond your roles, beyond your story, beyond your personality, beyond everything that can be lost, because it was never just yours to begin with. This is what every spiritual tradition is pointing toward. Not something you need to achieve, but something you need to recognize. You're already it. You've always been it. The seeking is the obstacle. The effort is what's in the way. Surrender. The seeking and what you've been looking for reveals itself as what's been looking through your eyes all along. But don't take my word for it. Test it. Try it. Practice surrender in small ways and see what happens. Notice where you're holding tension and release it. Notice where you're forcing and relax. Notice where you're controlling and let go. Just for a moment, just as an experiment, and notice what shifts. You might be surprised. You might discover that life supports you more than you realized, that people appreciate your authenticity more than your performance, that solutions appear when you stop forcing, that creativity flows when you stop controlling, that love deepens when you stop defending, that peace is possible when you stop resisting. And gradually, through accumulation of these small experiences, faith might grow. Not faith in a belief system, but faith as lived experience, faith as trust earned through testing, faith as the natural result of surrendering and discovering. You're held, and this faith will carry you through the hard times, the times when surrender feels impossible, the times when every fiber of your being wants to grab control. In those times, remember that you've let go before and survived. Remember that control was always an illusion. Remember that resistance creates suffering. Remember that the way through is surrender. Remember that you're not alone. Remember that this too shall pass. Remember that you're stronger than you think, not because you can hold on, but because you can let go. Remember that you're loved, whether you believe it or not, whether you feel it or not. Loved by life itself, which gave you existence. Loved by the intelligence that animates the cosmos. Loved by the source from which you came and to which you'll return. Loved in your perfection and your imperfection, your strength and your weakness, your light and your dark. This love asks nothing of you except that you receive it, and receiving is surrender, opening your hands, opening your heart, opening yourself to be filled by something you did not manufacture, cannot control and don't deserve, yet is given freely, abundantly, endlessly. This is grace. This is what's available when you surrender. Not someday, not after you've become better or done more or figured it all out. Now, in this moment, exactly as you are. So take a breath, let it out slowly, and with it, release everything you're holding, every tension, every worry, every burden, every need to know or control or understand, just for this one breath. Let it all go, surrender completely, and notice, even in this one breath, there is relief. There is space. There is a hint of the peace that surpasses understanding, the peace that comes not from arranging life to your liking, but from accepting life on its own terms. This is the peace of surrender, and it's yours whenever you're ready to receive it. Not earned through effort, but discovered through release. Not achieved through striving, but revealed through stillness. Not created through control, but uncovered through trust. The path is clear. Let go, surrender, trust, be, and discover that what you've been seeking through all your effort has been here all along, closer than your breath, intimate as your being, waiting only for you to stop long enough to notice it. This is the invitation. This is the call. Not to become something you're not, but to surrender into what you've always been. Not to go somewhere you're not, but to arrive fully where you are. Not to achieve some future state, but to recognize the perfection of this present moment, even with all its imperfection. Surrender and discover that you're already home. You've always been home. You just forgot while you were busy trying to get somewhere else. Welcome back. Welcome home. Welcome to the life that's been waiting for you to stop resisting it and start receiving it. Welcome to surrender.